Hi everyone. This paper was originally done for the Race and Socially Engaged Research Conference in September 2023, held at York St John University, and it was based on PhD findings at the time that I had about the Matta Fancanta youth movement in Northampton, um, which ranged, which I basically said ranged from 77 to 85, even though I know it went past that as well. It was based on the findings I had at the time. And at the time, I didn't know the dates of when the building was demolished, which was 1995. So, um, in that thought, this paper is based on old findings, and I want to maintain that at the time because it's useful to reflect on work I've done and where I was when I was doing it as well. So, this paper was done at York St John in September last year. This paper is about the Matta Fancanta youth movement 1977 to 1985, based on interviews I conducted as part of my PhD about Northamptonshire's Caribbean post-war Caribbean history, both those that were born here and those who came here. Matta Fancanta is a compound term from the Amharic language native to Ethiopia and the Wolof language of Senegal, Mauritania, and the Gambia, combining basically meaning can guard yourself against self-destruction. MFM, as it's known colloquially in Northamptonshire, advocated for self-help for young black people. Many black youths at the time had nowhere they could be together as authentic as their authentic selves. Some were homeless, and others were viewed as loiterers in the local shopping centre, the Grosvenor Centre, which was built around 1974. So Matta Fancanta was a response to that, and provided a day centre and in some cases somewhere to sleep. This ethos of self-help was antagonistic to institutions who benefited from black subservience. In many ways, Matta Fancanta challenged the previous wartime creation of the welfare state, as in 1942, establishmentarian William Beveridge wrote a report for the government that effectively promotes what we now know as state welfare. The very concept of self-help challenges that idea. In a Britain that has always operated in violent systems of control, self-help is in response to a society that was never designed to help everybody escape disadvantage. At this point, being black male in Britain was nothing short of being an occupational hazard, according to some. In Northampton, many black men were victim to police harassment that was effectively entrapment to commit crimes and then be arrested for it. At this time, unemployment was on the rise and was on the rise where young black males in Northampton were vilified and criminalised by local institutions, including the police, the council, and the local news media as well. Interviewing people that are now honoured as elders, I was informed firsthand that local institutions that are now somewhat grifting on this term Black British history were part of the systems denying Black people their heritage. This was not just the council giving Black organisations uninhabitable housing and buildings, but also the racist abuse Black kids experience in education. For many of my participants, or storytellers, I should say, schooling in Northampton was more about survival than education. So MFM was a response to this, where in many parts of life, Black people, but particularly Black youth, had nowhere they felt safe. Today, many people still die from that invisible hand of what Friedrich Engels called social murder, writing about the Victorian conditions of poverty, while Mbembe refers to this as death worlds, bringing in that discussion to racism as well. The origins of Matta Fancanta begin in the early 70s when Lee Bryant and his friends drove from London to the Gambia. Whilst there, these young people were inspired by Gambian youngsters, all under the age of 18, who owned a youth centre on a beach, providing for the local community. It was the Gambia that showed how Black people in Britain had colonised brains, according to Lee, because there was an over-reliance on the institutions to cater for Black upliftment. They brought those experiences back to Northampton, When home, the ethos of Matta Fancanta started at Lee's house, and every night for weeks his house was full of people wanting to know about that trip he and his friends took. I think it was around 1973, 74. Um, Eventually, they squatted a place. So they've squatted the Salvation Army Citadel on Sheep Street that the council was preparing to knock down. That night, they were confronted by the police. Media representations effectively criminalised black people for squatting a building that was set to be demolished by the state. This is the pretext to MFM, and it started on the African continent in the Gambia. It was reportedly the first black self-help organisation in the UK. They were not about going to enablers for like councils for help. Institutions like the local authority were enablers who could just as easily disable organisations as they wanted to. Or did they agree with you? This movement was what I would call DIY activism, do it yourself. It became a hub of the Rasta culture and sound system, a vessel for many artists who would later perform in many of the cities. In the 70s, Northampton and the rest of the world was introduced to roots reggae. These artists sang songs of revolution, rebellion, and injustice, giving hope to people in a time when they were being multiply oppressed. Such artists included Bob Marley, Burning Spear, Steel Pulse, Aswad, and more brought this message to the mainstream. Blues dances that continued well into the 80s were the prequel, yet sibling, to sound system events. You might see a column of speakers that the size of a wardrobe, producing thunderous sounds. Through sound system, peace and love was also promoted by selector DJs. In Northampton, these gigs were played at MFM on Sheep Street, as they held many events where people would come from all over the country. Artists even came from Jamaica to perform at Matta Fancanta. This was a music that kept everyone's sanity and united people together, a cultural lifeline to a generation of young people, and its universal message crossed over to wider audiences outside of black communities, crossing cultural boundaries. This music was so powerful it made a whole generation's identity. Matta Fancanta held these events, but their ethos of self-help also practiced upskilling people that had been excluded from the mainstream, including through training people in electronic engineering. It also was about self-improvement, and the first black football team in Northampton, I believe it was convened around there, and they were called the Persuaders, but I still don't have the specifics around that yet. Their ethos of self-help, embedded in black community struggle, not only challenged white organisations, but also other black groups that wanted to be included in the whiteness, to put it bluntly. In large, these were the Windrush children and the first generation of British kids, black British kids, who were excluded by white people and their parents because they did not subscribe to the politics of respectability. So white people and the black kids' own parents, including many cases choosing to take the customs and culture of Rastafari. By its nature, it was a form of decolonisation that upset the Windrush elders and white people. MFM was positioned to tackle the material problems black youths experienced when white organisations and other black organisations sometimes kicked them to the curb, to put it bluntly. One of the founding members of Matta Fancanta, Pedro Samuels, who came to Northampton from St. Kitts, told me many young people didn't see the elders as community leaders, but they did see MF leaders that way. The elders were more interested in being included into white establishments and discourses of empire-bought activism, and the same could be said somewhat today across the country. MFM was built on the ethos that integration doesn't work. The elders were set on being included, while the youngsters were set on upsetting the system. MFM effectively provided a day centre for young black people that had been marginalised elsewhere, including by white people and black elders. Once MFM was established, they also managed to help other organisations around the country, including Derby, Leicester, Coventry, and London. For example, their work with the sound system and music brought all these communities um, together because they all had similar issues. Over the years, many artists played that movement. However, they also upskilled people so they could get jobs and become employable. There was also a magazine run by a man called Herbert Mackenzie, open days, sound system events, meetings with other organisations. They also owned their own printing press. They were not dependent on others, so they didn't have to rent it from anybody. In comparison to Brixton and Notting Hill in London, Handsworth in Birmingham, and Moss Side in Manchester, all who had very earthy black communities, Northampton was viewed as countryside people. Yet the knowledge Lee and his friends brought back from Africa in the 70s was an ideology or way of thinking that told young black people to be black and proud, so black Northamptonians to be black and proud. Lee was Rasta, and in those days he was pushing a message through MF that told British-born black youths, a people who had been taught to be ashamed of themselves and their blackness, to reconnect with their African heritage and emancipate themselves of their mental slavery, of white supremacy, and further decolonize their minds. Very much in the ethos of Bob Marley and many of those people at the time. This is an incredibly powerful thing, particularly for Northampton, even now would be seen as radical and confrontational. And because of these ideas being pushed, it made MF a target. Due to the congregations of black people, it was somewhat an attraction for racist policing as well. In the end, what destroyed movement was was not only how black people were more accepting of others than they are of us, but also the police reportedly planted undercover officers to find something to sink the organization with. They raided a few times and never found anything. Perceptions of it being a drug den, because most people that went there were black. This led to a court case in the 80s over an alleged dodgy alcohol license. It was completely above board. They were not found guilty. And it was eventually demolished in '95. And there were newspaper articles and things around about drug and gun dealers and things like that. So there's a whole story around that side of it as well. But that was in the minority. It was a few people that made it unattractive, and that was compounded by, in my opinion, many of the older Windrush generation's own perceptions of Rastafarians in general. It was mixed with in-community prejudice, white racism, and certain people making certain decisions that were not good for everybody, and also some people I was told was taking money off the top as well. So there was a lot of there's lots of competing reasons as to why MF failed. But what I do think is that if MF was supported by their elders from the beginning, it would have made it a lot more difficult for other people to come in and dismantle it from within. Anyway, yeah. To talk about Matta Fancanta is to discuss ghosts and the spectres of white terror that still exist when you talk about this in Northampton. The formation of Matta Fancanta exemplifies the burden white terror had on Northampton black youths in the 70s. Christina Sharp's book In the Wake is directly appropriate for asking questions of racism and black mortality that MFM were fighting against on the streets. I've called home for nearly all my life. The experiences of these people sit in the afterlife of enslavement with the wake of many ongoing state-sanctioned legal and extra-legal murders of black people, which, like America, exists in Britain as a rites of passage for blackness, with anti-blackness rendered necessary for the functionality of our institutions, no less than in Northants. In the late 80s, my cousin Mark was found dead in the river. I think it was the river. It must have been either the Nene or the Avon, and at the time, there were loads of news articles going about it, and it was a big thing at the time. MFM had guarded many from similar fates. So come guard yourself from self-destruction. The state's reaction to black self-help, self-organizing, and self-help being one of suspicion and criminalization, including the criminalization of the Salvation Army Citadel, later demolished, even though it was a Grade 2 listed building. So think about that as well. To discuss MFM is to discuss ghosts and how Northampton's institutions made ghosts out of blackness. They tore down the buildings and managed black people out, both those born here and those who came here, out of our community centres as well. Now it's entirely possible to visit Northampton and not know there was a Caribbean community, but you will see the council celebrating Windrush Day. So effectively, shit in their hands and clap. So to talk about Caribbean Northants would be to talk about the spectres of blackness, and my PhD is largely one of chasing ghosts. I've seen this historical amnesia before. As a black person, as a neurodivergent person, someone that's disabled, I'm not afforded the privilege to forget the violent institutions of white supremacy, ableism, and eugenics, in whose wake disabled people and people of African descent live. So this cult of forgetfulness is national and also localized in this very much haunting of whiteness, as our murderers come with smiles. Reggae, MFM, and collective black identities brought these people together. Matta Fancanta were able to push a pro-black message in Northampton in the same era as reverberations of racism happening nationwide. MFM was more than sound system and a musical education. In Northampton, it was their introduction to their transformation as black people. It was a life support system that said Black Lives Matter when the discrimination from local white groups and black groups, some of them run by their own parents, meant black youth had no support, both from state and family. Thank you very much. And as usual, if you have opinions and thoughts, leave a comment, or you can send me an email as well. So treyventour.com/contact.